Have you ever wondered how to retrofit your table saw with an overarm dust collector? Well, today I'm going to show you how to make your own. Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of DP Shop Talk. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to build your own overarm dust collector for your table saw. Now this is a follow-up video by popular request to the previous video I did on 4 different table saw dust collection upgrades. So in this video what I'll do is completely disassemble the overarm collector into all its individual components, and then I'll show you how to make each of those components and then how it all goes back together again. So hopefully this will give you a good idea of how to make your own if you want to add this to your table saw. So we'll start off with what I did to reinforce the underside of the extension table. I added a piece of 3/4 inch plywood where the overarm attaches with pocket hole screws just to give some extra thickness and rigidity there. Now there's also some hardwood ribs that I added to the underside of the table. Now, I did that years ago just to help keep the extension table flat. So that piece of plywood that I put on there, I pocket hole screwed that into the side of the center rib just to kind of tie it all together. And then I also added just a simple plywood leg down to the metal angle that ties the 2 legs together, just to give some extra support as well. So whatever setup you have for your extension table, you just want to make sure that you reinforce it enough that it will support that extra weight and strain that the overarm creates. So now for the basic structure of the overarm. It's basically made up of 1.5 by 1.5 square aluminum tubing and Baltic birch and some nuts and bolts, and that kind of creates the whole structure of it. So to start off with, I cut the aluminum tubing to length for the height that I wanted it to be, and then the length based on the width of my extension table on the table saw. So to cut it, I don't have a lot of metalworking gear in my shop, so I just used my recip saw, clamped it down with a square block on the top to kind of guide the blade and chop through it. That worked pretty well. Cleaned it up a little bit with the file, and it was good to go. Now the Baltic birch braces, what I did is laminated 2 layers of 1/2 inch Baltic together to give me 1 inch thick. So I made 2 squares of laminated blanks, and then I put them on my crosscut sled and split them diagonally corner to corner, and that gave me 2 sets of perfectly square identical triangles to use for the braces. So the way that I made the holes, because they're 5/16 holes through the braces and the aluminum tubing to take the 5/16 bolts. So what I did is I took each piece and put the triangles in place where I wanted them, got everything lined up, everything flushed on both surfaces, and then clamped it down to a piece of plywood, and then took the whole thing to the drill press and drilled through with a 5/16 bit top to bottom to give me holes that line up right through from both surfaces so that everything aligns properly when you go to assemble it. And then did the same thing with the top arm and then the lower triangles too. So you just do that as a process, and everything comes out nicely lined up. So I'll show you how to assemble all of this and then install it on the saw. So now for actually installing the basic structure of the overarm on the table saw. Now, I forgot to mention earlier when I was showing you how to make these components that the two top edges of the triangles get 4 pocket holes in them each, and that's what actually attaches it to the table saw. So in this case, I've just started 2 screws because I have the holes there from before, so I'll just line those up with where they were before and drive them home. Now, obviously if you're building one for the first time, you don't have those holes, so you're going to want to make sure everything's kind of lined up and parallel with the front and back edges of your table saw, and get that mounted in place, and also how far back or forward you need it to be to line up with where your blade sits. So rather than boring you driving the rest of these 8 pocket hole screws, we'll move on to the next part. So now that the basic structure of the overarm is done, we'll take a look at the business end of things where the dust collection happens. So the first component is just a piece of 1/2-inch Baltic birch that attaches to the end of the aluminum arm. Now what I've done is cut a little block also of 1/2-inch Baltic birch that fits snugly inside the end of the aluminum tube. So I glued and brad nailed that on, reinforced it with a screw, and then that slips inside the end and gets attached through the aluminum with a couple screws, which you'll see later. I pre-drilled the holes for the attachment and then made a couple notches as well for where the heads of the carriage bolts come up higher and need somewhere to recess into. So then there's 2 pieces of plexiglass that attach to that to ultimately put the dust collection shroud in place. Now these I just cut to size on the table saw and pre-drilled them, countersunk them for the screws that I needed. And then the slots, I made those on the router table. So what I did is I set the fence to the distance that I wanted for my setback, and then plunged down through with a 1/4-inch spiral bit, ran it along, and pulled it back up again. Now I took 2 passes on each one to make the main 1/4-inch groove and then one to slightly widen it, because if you make that 1/4-inch groove exactly 1/4-inch, then your 1/4-inch carriage bolt is not going to slide well. So if you widen it out just a little bit, not so much that the square is going to turn in that slot, but just enough that it slides freely. So the dust collection shroud itself is actually a Bosch router dust collection cup for doing edge forming, so that attaches to the underside of your router base and catches dust as you're doing edge profiles. So I'll put the model number for this in the video description below if you want to see where you can get that. Now the only modifications that I made were I cut the front edge a little bit so that when it's mounted on, everything is flush at the front there and doesn't interfere with the crosscut sled. And then of course the notch in the front of it for the blade to actually come through. I made both of those cuts on the crosscut sled on my table saw. So I just put it down, ran it through a couple times to make the notch, obviously wider than the blade, so you have a little bit extra wiggle room there. And then the same thing with the cut on the front. Did that on the crosscut sled as well. So that's all the components of the actual dust collection end of things. There's a couple 1/4-20 knobs that go on to the carriage bolts to lock everything in place as you slide it up and down. So I'll show you how all of this gets assembled, and then we'll install it on the saw. So now for the grand finale and to bring it all together. So as you may have noticed in the last clip where I showed you how to put all this, or how to assemble all of this, I didn't show actually putting the small machine screws and the nuts and the washers on that attach the dust collection shroud to the piece of plexiglass. Reason for that is they're small and fiddly, and it's a bit of a pain in the butt process to get them on, so I thought rather than boring you, I'll just put those on ahead of time and just point them out. So that's the reason for that. So as I mentioned, there's just a small square of Baltic birch attached to the main plate here that fits into the end of the aluminum. Now it's a nice snug fit so that it registers well. So that just slides on, and then there's just a couple of screws. So I pre-drilled through the aluminum. One screw on the front, and one screw on the top. So that locks it on, makes everything nice and solid. Now, just a note about the screws and the pre-drilled holes in the plexiglass. These two here, as well as the two that attach the dust shroud to the plexi, or this piece of plexi, those are countersunk in so that as it travels up and down, those screw heads don't interfere with the two pieces of plexi sliding together. Now these two up here, they're pan head because they're up above where the plexi travels, so it's not an issue. So you need to make sure that those screws are actually like a bugle head wood screw or machine screw, and they're countersunk in. So for the actual hose for the dust extractor, I've been using just one of the hoses from my Bosch extractor. You can use any hose. I've actually found some pool hose at a local building supply center that's very, very similar and pretty much the same diameter as the Bosch hose. Now I bought this piece as sort of a sample, and I was hoping to get more of it to make a dedicated hose for the overarm, but I went back and they were out of stock. So I'm hoping to get some of that somewhere along the line to replace the actual Bosch hose, so I can get that back to my dust extractor. So basically it just plugs into the dust shroud and goes over to the side, and then I've just been using plastic wrap to just lash it to the overarm. But I mean, you can use cable ties or whatever works to attach it with. Now I attach the hose for the overarm to my dust extractor, the Bosch dust extractor, and then the 4-inch hose that comes from the dust collector, that goes to the bottom. So they're both separate and dedicated. The reason for that is I want the maximum suction that I can get at the overarm. If I split off that 4-inch line into the main 4-inch that comes into the bottom of the saw and then branch this off, you're not going to get quite the same suction power. So that's why I have two separate units. It really gives the maximum dust collection efficiency. So I hope that you found this helpful in going about building your own overarm dust collector for your table saw. Like I mentioned earlier, if you haven't seen the original video on 4 different table saw dust collection upgrades, make sure you check that out as well. It shows the overarm collector in action, and I explain the reason behind the design of the collector and why I made it the way I did. So if you have any questions for me on how to build it, anything that I may not have covered in enough detail in the video, make sure you leave your questions below and I'll answer any questions that you might have. Also, make sure that you leave your thoughts, ideas, what's worked for you in the comments below so we can get some shop talk going. So again, I hope you found this video helpful. If you have, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and leave those super important comments below. So thanks for watching, and until next time, let's talk shop.